Welcome to Philosophical Conversations. I'm Sarah Jane Leslie. We are all familiar with the idea of a political revolution. In a relatively brief period of time, one governing body is deposed and replaced with another, such as when American revolutionaries overthrew British colonial rule and established the United States of America. A somewhat less familiar notion is that of a scientific revolution, wherein a seemingly established scientific orthodoxy is replaced with a strikingly different outlook. We might speak, for example, of the Copernican revolution, which replaced the Ptolemaic view, according to which the sun and other planets orbit the Earth, with the modern heliocentric understanding of our solar system. But what if the orthodoxy to be replaced is not a scientific one, but rather a moral one? History provides us with many instances of such moral revolutions, periods of time in which society comes rapidly to reject as immoral a practice which it previously sanctioned. In imperial China, the feet of upper-class women were bound, an incredibly painful practice which was inflicted on them as they were little more than toddlers. As a writer during the Song dynasty, which ruled from 960 to 1279, put it, children not yet 4 or 5 years old, innocent and without crime, are caused to suffer limitless pain. Or in the words of a traditional proverb, one pair of tiny feet, but 2 cisterns of tears. The holy grail of foot binding was the 3-inch golden lotus, a foot so severely bound that in adulthood it measured no more than 3 inches. Needless to say, the practice was as crippling as it was agonizing. An adult woman with 3-inch feet would not, in most cases, be able to walk unassisted. The practice endured for nearly a millennium, yet within a single generation, not long after the dawn of the 20th century, it had all but vanished. In this relatively brief window of time, foot binding came to be viewed as backwards, immoral, and importantly, as shameful. In a recent book entitled The Honor Code, Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah draws our attention to moral revolutions such as these and asks how it is that they come about. As the title of the book suggests, Professor Appiah argues that the notion of honor, more so than the more philosophically familiar notion of morality, plays a key role in such events. As the prominent member of the Chinese literati Kang Youwei wrote in 1898, there is nothing which makes us objects of ridicule so much as foot binding. We're joined today by Professor Appiah, who is Professor of Philosophy and Law at NYU and who has held appointments in philosophy and African American studies at Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Cornell, the University of Ghana, and other institutions. Professor Appiah was recently awarded the National Humanities Medal and has been named by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the leading global thinkers of our time. Professor Appiah, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Now, what is this notion of honor that's at play here?
I think the heart of it is very simple. Honor is a right to respect, or an entitlement to respect. And so to say that someone has honor is to say that they're entitled to respect. To be concerned for your honor is to be concerned that people give you the respect that is, as we say, your due, that you're entitled to, due respect. And to say that someone's honorable is to say that they're worthy of the respect that they're entitled to. So I think once you see that, a lot of the ways we talk and think about honor sort of fall into place. When I give somebody an honorary degree, I'm saying that their academic work entitles them to respect in the domain of scholarly assessment.
Do you think that honor is an antiquated notion, or is it one that's still relevant to everyday life?
There's no doubt that there are enemies of the word honor in the world today, and that it does seem to have a kind of archaic feel to it. But I think that if you look around and if you take this basic idea of the right to respect, that idea, and the idea that that right to respect is governed by social codes and so on, that which is at the heart of the system of honor codes, that idea is just completely pervasive in the modern world as it was in the past. When a young man in an American ghetto is dissed, that is disrespected, denied the respect that he thinks is his due, he responds in a way that would have been perfectly familiar to Achilles or the Duke of Wellington or Prince Hal. He tries to claim that right to respect back by doing what in that culture is coded as the proper way of recovering your honor. So I think it's everywhere, both in that individual sense of individual honor, and of course in the sense of collective honor. If you think about how many of us feel about something like the horrors of what happened in Abu Ghraib, or what's going on in Guantanamo, or the ridiculously high levels of incarceration in our country, where we have a quarter of the world's prisoners but 4% of the world's population. I mean, all of these are the sorts of things that bring shame, I think, to anyone who has a sense of American honor. And that's motivating. It makes you want to do something about it. It makes you want to vote for people who will do something different. It makes you want to write to your congressman and complain. It makes you write op-eds. It makes you bang the table and tell your students that it's a scandal and they ought to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you argue that the movement away from foot binding in imperial China was in part motivated by a concern for the nation's honor. Are there other historical examples where we find moral revolutions motivated by honor?
Yes, I think in many different ways. That's an example where national honor is at stake, and as I mentioned, I think there's a reason for us Americans to be concerned about our national honor, as there is for all patriotic citizens of every society. Another way in which honor can be important in bringing about moral revolutions, moral change, is when honor switches sides, which it often does. So, for example, in the history of dueling in Great Britain, which was a practice that went on in a form that's roughly recognizable in, as it were, Romeo and Juliet, from about that time, from about Renaissance England on until the mid-19th century. That kind of dueling was a way of recovering your honor. If someone had accused you of lying or being a coward or various kinds of challenges to your honor, you could recover your honor by challenging him to a duel and fighting him. And you could recover your honor by fighting him and dying. You could recover him by fighting and winning. It didn't matter if you took up the duel, you got your honor back. By the mid-19th century, what happened was if you challenged someone to a duel, people found you ridiculous. They laughed at you. They mocked you. Mm. And so from having been a source of a mechanism by which you could recover the right to respect, it actually became a mechanism that lost you respect. Mm. And at that point, it was gone, it collapsed, and nobody would do it anymore. So one of the things, and if you think about it, think about all kinds of change, large and small, some of it not even moral. Think about the changing attitudes to smoking, mm-hmm. right? One thing you might feel about as it were, smokers today is that because it's now thought to be kind of evidently imprudent at the very least to smoke, and also maybe a bit antisocial, there's a kind of shame attached mm-hmm. to it. And so what's happened is that something that used to be actually sort of sexy and attractive has become and a source of respect has become a source of disrespect. And in a more important case, I think that one of the really striking things that's happened in the last 50 years or so in the United States is that not so much that racism and sexism have come to be recognized to be wrong, because the arguments that they were wrong were already well in place 50 years ago, but they've come to be thought of as discreditable in a not just morally discreditable, but it's kind of embarrassing, shameful to be caught in a racist or a sexist moment. And again, that's a small example. I don't mean that the abandonment of racism and sexism is a small thing, but it's an example of the way in which honor, shifts in honor, have an effect in shaping people's behavior.
So you would specifically maintain that when we see these revolutions, it's not just a matter of people recognizing something that they had heretofore thought of as moral, as being in fact immoral, but rather something more complex involving honor going on. Why shouldn't we just think that people come to, say, see more vividly or appreciate more viscerally that certain practices are just immoral and thereby abandon them?
Well, I think the main reason why is that it doesn't look like that's what's going on if you look at the historical record. Because what's really striking, take the case of honor foot binding, what's really striking about that case is that every argument that you can think of against the practice, it's already there in the record, sometimes hundreds of years before the beginning of the anti-foot binding movement. It wasn't that nobody knew the arguments. And the same is true about dueling, by the way. I mean, people mostly don't know about dueling that, as I said, the modern form of duel starts in the Renaissance in England. It's illegal from the very beginning. It's banned. Francis Bacon, known to us as a philosopher, but he was also Lord Chancellor and Attorney General, and he prosecuted people for dueling. So it was illegal, and it was condemned by the Church long before that. It was condemned by the Church in the 9th century. And that was reaffirmed at the Reformation at the Council of Trent. It's a self-excommunicating offence. Nobody has to excommunicate you. If you duel, you're out. So it was unchristian. It was illegal. It was plainly in breach of lots of Christian and moral ideas. I mean, it involves trying to kill someone, for example. And one of the Ten Commandments says, "Thou shalt do no murder." So it was. All the arguments against it are in place. It's also crazy, by the way. I mean, duels are crazy because who wins doesn't depend on who's right, and it's a really weird mechanism for solving a normative problem, to engage in a practice whose outcome doesn't depend on the normative facts. Unlike a trial, for example, where some attempt is made to find what the normative facts are and set it that way.
The guilty party is at least more likely to be punished than the innocent party, whereas in a duel,
it's just the best. It's just the good luck or the best swordsman. So it's crazy. It's unchristian. It's immoral. It's illegal. It goes on for several hundred years anyway. So it isn't. I don't think we can say that the arguments change. There are no new arguments. And it's not even that the arguments aren't recognized. If you read the wills that people write the night before duels, which was a wise thing to do since you had a fairly high chance of dying, in the course of them they say, "I realize this is an unchristian act, but honor requires me to do it nevertheless."
A natural view is that moral revolutions are fueled by new moral insights. Professor Appiah argues, however, that the historical record suggests otherwise. So unlike a model that's perhaps more familiar in the philosophy classroom, whereby we reflect on moral principles, come to appreciate in light of them which actions are right, which actions are wrong, and then choose those right actions, you're presenting a more complex, nuanced vision of how these sorts of changes actually occur in societies.
Absolutely. And I don't want to say that the moral recognition doesn't matter. It's absolutely crucial that the moral recognition does matter, because when the honor change happens, part of what's shameful is that you're doing something wrong, right? So I don't want to say that there's no role for the moral recognition. If those arguments hadn't been in place, if people hadn't been in a position to see that it wasn't just something you didn't want to do, but something you shouldn't do, then the argument that it was shameful, for example, for the Chinese, depends upon saying, look, this is something we do that involves cruelty to our daughters. And that's wrong. Cruelty to our daughters is wrong. The Chinese knew perfectly well you shouldn't be cruel to your children. That wasn't a discovery that they suddenly made in the 1890s. So I think that the moral stuff is important. I don't want to deny that. And so is the legal stuff, which gives force to it. But by themselves, it turns out, it seems to me, they don't do the work. What's needed is this other shift in consciousness. And the shift in consciousness is one in which people come to think of the old practice, which used to be one that either left you with your entitlement to respect or actually gained you respect, come to see that as a source of something that will lose you respect. And then that, as it were, socializes, makes social the recognition of the wrongness, because now not only do you see that it's wrong, but you know that if you're seen doing it, you'll be losing the respect of your peers, the people who live in your moral universe. And also you'll be losing your right to self-respect, because if you lose your right to respect, then you lose your right to self-respect.
So now, more specifically, what is the relationship between honor and morality? Clearly there are cases in which immoral practices that are known to be immoral, such as dueling, were sustained for many hundreds of years by practices of honor. So honor needn't follow what we think is moral. But in order for moral revolutions to be genuine, to constitute genuine moral progress, you would have to think there would be some ultimate intimate relationship between these two notions.
It would be nice, it would be very nice if we could, as it were, guarantee that when honor moves, it moves in the right direction. But I'm afraid I don't think we can guarantee that. So here's what I think. I think now of honor really as a distinct sort of normative system of its own. And the task, if you're morally engaged, is to bring it into the service of morality, which it can be. So honor can be powerfully directive in the right direction, and the task is to reframe the honor codes and to reframe the world of honor in such a way that it not only abandons the immoral things that have been associated with honor, which include, as you said, dueling, but also just the whole set of structures of, for example, class prejudice and discrimination against people of what in England in the 19th century would have been called the lower orders. All that was associated with this honor world. And that, I think, by the way, is one of the really important reasons why the word honor got into discredit, because it was associated with this really undemocratic, nasty side of the old aristocratic cultures. And that's good. But it can be democratized, it has been. It can be civilized, it can be directed towards moral ends. And so that's the task. I mean, you could say, well, why not just abandon it? Why not just focus on morality? The trouble is that I think the sort of psychological structures that sustain honor and shame are so deep in us that it'd be rather hard to do without them. Better to see if we can turn them in the right direction. I want to make one other point, though, about the independence of honor and morality, and that's this, that honor can be used to sustain values that are not moral values. What's an honorary degree is not, people who get honorary degrees are not spectacularly good in general. That's not why we give people honorary degrees. Well, we have honorary degrees for philanthropy, so I suppose those are meant to be for people who are good or who do good things. But the ones we give to scholars, we give to them because we value great scholarship. And similarly, when we honor great actors or great musicians, great novelists, people in the world of sports, those are not moral values. They are values, but they're not moral values. And honor is recruited, as it were, to serve those values. And that's fine, because provided those other values aren't in conflict with morality. And I don't think, for example, that valuing tennis is in conflict with morality. So it's okay to honor, Andre Agassi or whoever your favorite tennis player is.
To return to the case of the Chinese rejection of foot binding, perhaps an optimistic cast might be that it was came to be viewed as shameful because it was recognized as being immoral, and finally that was, after 1,000 years, connected with a sense of shame. But perhaps another more cynical viewpoint on it would be that look, the rest of the world, which around the turn of the 20th century finally became incredibly important to imperial China, the rest of the world didn't engage with this practice, found it obscure, silly, reacted with a certain, perhaps, amount of just ethnocentrism towards the whole thing. And that was really what prompted the rejection of it. Something far more instrumental that still implicates honor, but really has little to do with morality.
I think that the key reason why I don't think that's the right story has to do with who it was that persuaded people like Kang Yu-wei, who was one of the great anti-foot binding campaigners, one of the great Mandarin intellectuals of the late 19th, early 20th century, to get involved in anti-foot binding. He was persuaded, on his own account, he was persuaded by a dialogue with Protestant missionaries, and the Protestant missionaries with whom he was engaged in dialogue were people who were profoundly respectful of Chinese civilization. They were Reverend Richard, who was one of the people who translated the Bible into Chinese and had studied the Confucian classics in order to, as it were, get into the mind of China. He was someone who was puzzled by, he admired this great civilization, and so he was puzzled by its failings. Mm-hmm. So what Kang Yu-wei was responding to was an opening to a world of people who respected his civilization, but were critical of this one dimension of it, as they were admiring of other dimensions. So it was a matter of being drawn into what I call a single honor world, a world in which you share the sense of what's worthy of respect, now with a new set of people. And it's true that there may have been people in the regime who thought, hey, we're having a hard time dealing with these Europeans and these Japanese people, so why don't we just give them this thing in order to make things. But I don't think that's what was going on. What was going on was that they were coming to see themselves through the eyes of these new friends. And that's one of the things that honor does, is it sort of, when you're doing something wrong, what honor directs you to thinking about is how you look in the eyes of people you respect, in the eyes of people who respect you, in the eyes of your honor world. And that changes your attitude to what you're doing in a way that makes you more likely to abandon a practice if it's discreditable. So it is true that, you know, historical processes are complicated, and I'm not a historian, I'm just a poor philosopher, and so I've tried but the thought that it was a concern for honor that led to this is one that is there over and over again, I think, in the record and in the writings of people like Kang Yu-wei when he's writing his famous memorandum to the throne about why it should be abandoned. It begins and ends with talk about honor, and I don't think it was purely instrumental.
Honor has played an important role in several historical moral revolutions, but can we rely on honor to move us in a morally desirable direction? An interesting question that arises in the context of considering how instrumental honor can be in these cases is to think about a case in which, at least if things were slightly different than they are, we might find ourselves pushed towards adopting practices that we would consider, I think, correctly morally wrong. For example, there are numerous nations on earth that consider the Western nations to be shamed by the way that women in them behave, by the fact that women are accorded equal rights to men, women are able to dress as they please, drive on the road, engage in sex as they desire, and nations will legitimately view this as bringing shame on the United States or other Western countries. And in this way might actually hope that considerations of honor would force us to reject these practices and adopt a different sort of gender relation. Is there anything beyond the luck of who has the social, political, and economic power that can guard against a revolution pushing in that way?
I'm not I don't believe in providence, unfortunately, so I don't think there are any guarantees built into history in that way.
But is there anything to the notion of honor that might?
But I think there is this, that it's not just a matter of good or bad reputation, right? The concept of honor is the concept of an entitlement to respect, and the concept of shame is the concept of having done something that makes it appropriate to treat you with disrespect. So in order for you to get me to abandon gender equality as a norm, you have to first persuade me to see it as something that legitimately deprives me of the right to be respected. And the only thing that I could imagine that would do that would be an argument that there was something bad about gender equality. So if the Saudi, who thinks that the forms of gender equality that we've somewhat stumbled towards in our society are bad, says to me it's shameful, that's not going to work. What's going to work, it's only going to work if he can persuade me that there is something about what I'm doing that entitles him to regard me with contempt. And I can't imagine that happening in this particular case. So when the anti-foot binding campaigners from outside China talked to Kang Yu-wei, they didn't just say, it makes us laugh at you. They said, you are a great civilization. This is a terrible thing to be doing to your daughters, right? And that was what worked. They knew that there were things that they did that other people found strange, and they didn't stop doing them because they could see that that was ethnocentric. But they didn't. But it's not ethnocentric to say you shouldn't be doing that to your daughters, should you? After all, it's cruel and painful. So, but I want to be clear that honor has taken people in the wrong direction. I think a great example of that really has been the way honor figured very largely, I think, in the temperance movements that led to the passing of prohibition in the United States, which I think was a great mistake. And I think people largely agree with that, though we've managed to make the same mistake again with other forms of drugs. And so that, but honor was very, very big in the temperance. Honor and shame and those sort of issues were very big in the temperance movement. So you can and of course, a slightly more up-to-date example, I think, is we've only very recently shifted from thinking of homosexuality as a source of entitlement to disrespect, as opposed to a sort of normal part of the range of human sexuality. That shift. That shift to regarding homosexuality as dishonorable occurred relatively late in the West, and we've just recently, I think, succeeded in moving many people, at least, in the opposite direction. So it goes, honor giveth and honor taketh away, unfortunately, and so that's why it's really important to review claims made in the name of honor for their compatibility with our moral ideas. And if somebody says something is dishonorable, they have to offer a ground. They have to say why it loses you respect if you do that thing. And if what they are pointing to is something that morality affirms, then I think we should resist, as it were, the call of honor in the wrong direction.
And of course, an even more vivid example that happens, fortunately, very little in the United States, but happens quite widespread in other parts of the world, is that of honor killing, something that's specifically motivated by concerns for honor, but is obviously shockingly objectionable in all sorts of ways. Do you see hope that we might find in this case the same sort of moral revolution, itself driven by honor?
So, one of the reasons I'm hopeful about honor killing is that the tendency of history is against it, because it was a widespread practice in the Mediterranean world and cultures, both Christian, Muslim, and neither, until relatively recently. So, and it isn't anymore. It isn't anymore in Italy, for example. And I think that part of what happened in that case, and part of what is happening in a country like Pakistan, which probably has the largest number of honor killings in the world today, each year, what's going on in those places is that the kind of moral revolution that we saw with foot binding is underway. That is to say, the key, the brilliant slogan of the anti-honor killing movement in Pakistan is, there's no honor in honor killing. Right, and that is exactly the right argument, I think, to be making. Right. These are societies, whether you're talking about Afghanistan and the Pashtuns, or whether you're talking about people in other parts of other cultures of Pakistan. They all have notions of honor that are tied up with protecting women in your own family. They all think that it's shameful to let your women, to let bad things happen to your women, and actually for women to let bad things to happen to their men. So. And nothing could be worse than the death of a daughter or a sister or a wife. So I think that they're making the right arguments. There's been a big, it's not over. Honor killing, as I say, still goes on. There are hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 a year in Pakistan still. But I think the move is going in the right direction. I think that there are parts of the society in Pakistan that are convinced now that it's not honorable. And it has the feature that I pointed to in the foot binding case and in the dueling case, which is it's always been condemned by Islam. It's inconsistent with Sharia, not because you can't kill women and men who've been associated with sexual immorality. You can under Sharia, but you can't do it yourself. It has to be done. It has to be done through the courts. So it's a serious breach of Sharia, and there are endless fatwas against it. And as I say, these are not societies in which people don't care about their families. It's not. You have these extraordinary stories of people who've just killed a daughter, say, who's been dishonoured in some way, and therefore brought dishonour to her family. And the man who's just done it is weeping at the loss of his daughter. So it's not that they're unconflicted. Mm-hmm. They're very conflicted. They can see the arguments against it. It's not that they can't see the arguments against it. And the shift is, I think, beginning. No guarantees, but I do think that if you talk to younger people in Pakistan, it's clear, especially in the towns, but even more generally, that people are beginning to see that this is a sort of crazy way to behave. And I say crazy because in order to stop it, my argument is, you have to persuade people more than that it's wrong. The arguments that it's wrong are available already and have been for a long time.
You have to make people viscerally feel that it is dishonorable.
Dishonorable. And that's, as I say, that's beginning. Mm-hmm. So, and if you look at the sort of timetable of these things, the last great duel in England, I suppose, is the Duke of Wellington's duel around about 1830. By 1850, it's ridiculous. The anti-foot binding movement takes off in the 1890s. By 1910, nobody's doing it. It takes a generation, it takes 20 years, but I would say we've had 10 of the 20 in Pakistan. So I'm hoping that it doesn't mean there will be nobody doing it at the end of the next decade, but I really do think that the shift has begun. I'm moderately optimistic about that. Though, of course, 10 years of more than 1,000 women a year, that's not something to be happy about. But the fact that we may get to a point where it declines to 0, that is something to be happy about, and it's something we should all work on.
One might naturally suppose that a moral revolution must be primarily driven by moral considerations. This view, while perhaps familiar to those of us immersed in contemporary philosophical thinking, may present an overly simplistic view of human motivation. Of equal or greater importance may be the messier and more problematic notion of honor. While it may initially sound antiquated and irrelevant in today's world, honor may continue to be our best hope for moral progress. Professor Appiah, thank you so much for joining us here on Philosophical Conversations.
It was a great pleasure.
Wonderful to have you here.